Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the webinar. We're going to get started here in just a couple of minutes to give folks a chance to get logged in and settled in. While you're waiting, if you would like to go on your control panel and download the 2 handouts that you see there, we'll be engaging with those during the webinar today. So it'll be helpful if you have those downloaded before we start. Thanks, and we'll begin in just a couple of minutes. All right, hi everyone. We're going to get started tonight with our March Core Advocate webinar, Why Rigor Doesn't Mean Harder. We're really excited to have all of you with us tonight. Joining you from the Blue Room in New York is the entire Field Impact team. I'm Joni Funderburk, and Janelle Fan and Sandra Alberti are also here. And our special guest on tonight's webinar is Marnie Greenstein, who is a math specialist here at Student Achievement Partners. For those of you that might not be familiar with the Core Advocates program, we just want to share some quick information. We are a national network of educators who believe in the potential of the Common Core standards to prepare all students for college and careers, and who are interested and eager in supporting their colleagues and communities in advocating for and understanding the standards and standards-aligned instruction. If you're interested in learning more about the Core Advocate program, you can email either Janelle or me here on the Field Impact team. You can also complete a survey that we have, which is bit.ly.com/joincoreadvocates, or you can find a link on our website, achievethecore.org, to find more information about the Core Advocates program. For those of you that are in the Twitter sphere, We enjoy having people tweet about their learning on the webinars tonight. Feel free to log into your Twitter account now and tweet tonight using hashtag #CoreAdvocates. Also feel free to follow the hashtag #CoreAdvocates as well as @AchieveTheCore for great learning and information both about tonight's webinar and on other resources as well. I also tweet @JoniFun, Sandra is @SLBirdie, and Marnie is @math_Marnie. So we hope that you'll tag us on your tweets tonight. So just a couple of protocol suggestions here. During the webinar, we will ask you to engage with us periodically in a couple of different ways. One is that we'll ask you to access some documents, and if you haven't done that yet, now would be a good time to download the 2 handouts that are under the handout tab of your control panel. We will be working with those 2 documents as we progress through the webinar, so if you want to download them and have them open in another window on your computer, that would be helpful. We will also ask you to share your answer to some questions with us, and you do that using the questions section of your control panel. And then we'll also have some polls for you to engage in, and you'll see those poll questions just pop up on the screen, and you'll just interact with the polls by clicking on the appropriate spot. After the webinar is over tonight, you will receive a survey from us. We really appreciate you taking the time to give us your feedback. We use it to help make our webinars better from month to month. And then you will also receive, probably tomorrow night or so, access to the recording of tonight's webinar, and you'll also have access to the slide deck and all of the handouts that we used during the webinar tonight. So that being said, let's go ahead and get started and dive right into our content about Rigor. So we are going to break this up into 3 different sections, and we're going to talk first about how Rigor is built into the standards, and then we're going to talk about how we should see Rigor within the instructional materials that we're using, and then finally what the impact of a lack of balanced instruction around the 3 aspects of Rigor, what impact that might have on students and student learning. So that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Marnie to talk to us about how we see Rigor built into the standards.
All right, hello everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about Rigor. As we all know, working in education, people love buzzwords, and I think that Rigor might be everyone's favorite buzzword. So we're going to start out with kind of a fun little activity. We're going to ask people to type into the question box a sentence that you've heard or that you typically hear that uses Rigor in an educational context.
They're fast and furiously coming in here. You guys must have heard this before. You need to increase the rigor in your classroom. You need to increase the rigor of your questions. You need to up the rigor. Administrators want to see rigor. Rigor is important to keep in mind while planning. Are your questions on the quiz rigorous? Challenging questions require greater depth of knowledge. I give my students harder questions. How much more rigor can I provide? Let's see. What is the DOK of this standard? I want to make sure I create a rigorous task.
So it seems like we have lots and lots of examples of hearing rigor, and that a lot of them are kind of ambiguous in terms of what is actually meant. We know it's important, but what does it mean? And so thinking about what it meant, we turned to our favorite source of information, Google. And I Google searched the word rigorous, and the definition that you get when you do that is shown here. I think the first line of extremely thorough, exhaustive, or accurate is really telling. And when we think about it in terms of what kids need to know in their mathematical experience, I think we can all agree that those 3 words really tell what we want students to be able to come out of our math classrooms with in terms of their understanding. So we've got that definition of rigor, but we also have a very specific one when we're talking about it in the context of the Common Core standard. So Rigor is the third of our 3 shifts for instruction in mathematics. And when we talk about Rigor, we're talking about in major topics pursuing conceptual understanding, procedural skill and fluency, and application. And when we talk about it, it's not just these 3 things in any way, it's a balance of the 3 things. And to get to that balance, we need to really think about equal intensity in time, activities, and resources for all 3 of them. We have a favorite visual that we like to use around here to help think about how the pieces fit together here. So we have a 3-legged stool, and each of the aspects of Rigor can be thought of as being one of those legs. And we can't really shorten one of the legs or lengthen one of the legs or take one of the legs away, or we won't have that strong foundation for mathematics that our students need to gain. So one of the things to think about with these shifts is these aren't kind of things that we've just overlaid onto the standards and come up with, here's 3 things that are important. They're actually built into the architecture of the standards. And just like that's true for focus and coherence, it's also true for Rigor. So we're going to dive into some standards to see how the architecture of the standards really supports and demands that balance of Rigor. So if everyone could open the PDF document that's called Balance of Rigor in the Standards, you'll see the full text for 2 different groups of standards. We're going to start by talking about the set that comes from 2nd and 3rd grade. So these are a couple of selected standards from the progression for addition and subtraction that actually starts in kindergarten and goes all the way up through 4th grade. So if everyone could just take a minute and read those 3 standards, the 2nd and 3rd grade standards under addition and subtraction across grades. This is just a snapshot of the work that students do with addition and subtraction of whole numbers in elementary school. But what we can see is that within these standards, they are specifically calling out different aspects of Rigor. So if we look at the first one, 2NBT B7, students are adding and subtracting within 1,000 in 2nd grade. But you can see in that second sentence of the standard, it's talking about the understanding that students need to have. So this is not just the procedural skill of adding and subtracting, it's about building that conceptual understanding of how to add and what it means to have to compose or decompose to do so. So that first standard is really targeting conceptual understanding. We move down to the second standard, 20AA1. And we're looking at a smaller magnitude of numbers, adding and subtracting within 100, but you really see the application come through in terms of the emphasis on word problems, and then also that students will need that procedural skill to be able to solve them. And then when you look at what's required in 3rd grade, this is where you're really drilling down on the fluency piece of it. So there is a progression from conceptual understanding, including application, to fluency, but we see each of the aspects of Rigor called out in different standards within this domain. So that's how it works, how we see it in the architecture across grades, but this is also something that we see within grades. So the next set of standards that you have on that PDF come from the expressions and equations domain in 6th grade, and it all comes from a single cluster heading, 6EEB, reason about and solve one variable, equations and inequalities. So take a minute to read the 4 standards that are under that cluster. So the difference here is even when we're looking at multiple standards within a certain grade and with even in a cluster, we still see different aspects of Rigor called out in different places. So that first one starts with understand and really outlines that kids need to understand what's going on in terms of solving equations and inequalities. And then moving on to 6EEB6, we see the application come through in the ask that students are solving real-world mathematical problems, but also there's a conceptual understanding piece in terms of students understanding what a variable is and how to use it when they are modeling real-world problems. Moving on to 6EEB7, again, we see real-world, so we know we're looking at application, but again, students are asked to solve equations of a specific form, so that's where procedural skill comes in. And then in the last standard that's written there, we're looking at real world again, so we're talking about application. So once again, this balance of rigor is reflected within a grade level, within a specific cluster, to make sure that students are attending to all of them, and the standards are really calling out specific ways that kids need to build that balance of rigor. So we're going to move from looking at some examples to letting you do a little bit of work with this. So we're going to go into our first poll question, and we're going to look at a couple of different standards and ask people to identify the aspects of rigor that are targeted there. The reason we're doing this, it's really important. We often talk about listening to the standards in terms of the aspects of rigor that's required and attending to that. It would be really nice if every standard sorted into a category and we have a third in each of the aspects of rigor, but that's not quite how it works. It's a little messier than that, as we just saw. There's some standards require more than one aspect of rigor. So we're going to go through this exercise and see how we do it. So for this one, the PDF open that says name the aspect of rigor. And we're going to start by looking at the kindergarten standard that's at the top, KCC A1, which is count to 100 by ones and by tens. So if you can use the poll that's on your screen and check off the aspect or aspects of rigor that are targeted in this standard. So we're waiting to get a few more responses in, and then we'll take a look at the results. All right, so unfortunately we can't tell who picked maybe multiple aspects of rigor here, but we're seeing an overwhelming number of people who picked procedural skill and fluency. And that's right, kindergarten it can be tricky because this is where kids are just starting to learn about number. But this specific standard is just about knowing the rote counting sequence. They'll have other standards that ask students that get to the conceptual understanding about what counting actually means. But here we're just going for the procedural skill of being able to recite the number sequence. All right, then we're going to move on to the second standard that's on your list. We're looking at a high school standard here. And explain how the definition of the meaning of rational exponents follows from extending the properties of integer exponents to those values, allowing for a notation for radicals in terms of rational exponents. So if you can take a minute and choose the aspect or aspects of rigor that this standard targets. All right, so for this one, again, we see an overwhelming majority for conceptual understanding, and that's absolutely right. Here, we're really asking kids to think about the why of why a rule works, and so that's thinking about conceptual understanding and applying the work that they've done up to this point with rational numbers and with exponents. All right, we're going to take a look at one more. So we're looking at the third one, 5NSB4, apply and extend a previous understanding of multiplication to multiply a fraction or whole number by a fraction. All right, so let's take a look. Ooh, so this was an interesting one, and we put this one in as a bit of a challenge. So sometimes we want to be able to use keywords. There's been a lot of work in the past with unpacking standards of circle the nouns and underline the verbs and all of that. And when we do that, we see the word apply as the first word in the standard. So it makes sense that we think that it's an application standard. But when we think about what's targeted here, there isn't any mention of real-world problems, and that's or math in context, and that's really what signals that the standard is looking for application. So what the kids are applying here is they're applying previous understandings to be able to do some new math, not to apply previous understandings to real-world math. So for this one, we can make the case for either conceptual understanding or fluency or procedural skill. I would actually say it's both, because what they're doing is we really want them to have the understanding of multiplication, whole number multiplication, and how it works, and to say, you know what, it works the same way when I have a fraction and a whole number. We can see the procedural skill because by the end of it, students need to be able to actually do the multiplication. So this is a standard where we're seeing both conceptual understanding and procedural skill and fluency in there. And this is a standard that actually has subparts to it, and so with those, it probably would have been much clearer that it was conceptual understanding and procedural skill and fluency. So we're going to do one more quickly. So we're now looking at the 7th grade standard that's down at the bottom. Use proportional relationships to solve multi-step ratio and percent problems. And then there's a list of examples. So take a look and choose which aspect or aspects of rigor are targeted there. All right, let's take a look. Absolutely. All right, so this is an interesting one too, because it looks like, I'm guessing from the numbers, that people selected multiple aspects of rigor here. So this specific standard is asking for application, but students do need to use procedural skill and fluency to solve those application problems. So this is a great example where it's not necessarily named in the standard, but we know that kids aren't going to be able to solve the application without the procedural skill, and there will be actually other standards within the cluster or in previous grades where students are really developing those skills. So in 6th grade, students are responsible for operations, all 4 operations with rational numbers, and that's going to come into play in their ability to do application within this standard.
Marnie, I just want to say I appreciate the time to have us thinking about this in a really intense way. Like, it's not just about a quick glance over the language of the standard. We have to actually read carefully what the standard is saying, and I think it's helpful even to discuss with other teachers, like, what does this really mean and what is it asking kids to do to help us understand which aspect or aspects of rigor is targeted.
Absolutely. I had a conversation with one of the other math specialists today about each of these standards before we brought them out. So I think that's right, and always an opportunity for more learning. That's great. All right, so we're going to move on from thinking about how to analyze what's in the standards for aspects of rigor to what happens in instructional materials. So there's been a lot of research about the impact of instructional materials on the experience for students in the classroom. It's a huge indicator of the content that students are getting. So we really want to answer this question about how the balance of rigor should be reflected in instructional materials. So we're going to start out with a little bit of background that comes from the publisher's criteria. This is a document that was written by the authors of the standards to provide more detail about what materials should do to meet the expectations of the standards. So there is a whole section on rigor and balance, and what they're saying, it mirrors what we've been talking about so far. So materials and tools reflect the balances in the standards and help students meet the standards' rigorous expectations by. And then talking about what each aspect of rigor needs. So developing students' conceptual understanding of key mathematical concepts, where called for in specific content standards or cluster headings, making sure that attention is given throughout the year to the standards that set an expectation for fluency, and then thinking about how we are having students engage in application problems without losing focus on the major work of each grade. And I think this really harkens back to what we were talking about in terms of listening to the standard and attending to what is required in individual standards. So when you look at A and B here, it's talking about developing conceptual understanding where the standards require it, developing fluency where the standards require it. So an example here is thinking about sixth grade. Sixth grade has a fluency expectation for division, multi-digit division in sixth grade. So if you're looking at materials and they are developing conceptual understanding of division in sixth grade, it's showing that they're not actually reflecting what's required by the standards. And so you really want to look carefully at materials to make sure that it's matching what the standards call for. Similarly, thinking about applications, this is an area where the application should be enriching students' understanding of the major work and not detracting from it. So there's that line about not losing focus on the major work of each grade. An example here is thinking about the standards for third grade. In fractions, the big idea there is that students come out of third grade thinking about fractions as a number, and there's actually no expectation for application problems within that third grade work, so that students can really get to that conceptual understanding of what fractions are and what they mean. So that's not to say there should never be any application in third grade fractions, but it shouldn't be in a way that detracts from what students really need to come out of the third grade knowing in terms of that conceptual understanding. In addition to laying out what each aspect of rigor looks like, the publisher's criteria also talks about how the aspects of rigor work together. So the first idea here is that there is an interconnectedness about this work, and this is what we saw in the examples from second and third grade. Students need conceptual understanding to support their development of fluency and procedural skill. And then applications are a great opportunity to give students more practice with the fluency, as we saw with that seventh grade ratio and proportion standard. And applications can work to build conceptual understanding. So instructional materials should really focus on connecting the aspects of rigor where it makes sense as dictated by the standards. The flip side of that is that they're not always together. We talked at the beginning about each aspect of rigor requires equal time and intensity and focus. And so I think we can, probably all of us can think of examples of materials that really only focus on application and assume that kids were going to get to the fluency they needed or the understanding by doing those rich problems. And yeah, sometimes kids are developing that, but when we think about fluency and the need for kids to really get those multiplication facts by the end of third grade, there has to be specific time and attention to that. So we're looking to kind of see the aspects of rigor work together, but also to be each focused on so that instructional materials are really meeting the expectations of the standards. If you're interested in more information on the publisher's criteria, The whole document's available on our site. We also have PD modules that go to help teachers and educators understand what the publisher's criteria require in materials. We also have a tool, the Instructional Materials Evaluation Tool, which we lovingly call the IMET, which is designed for schools or districts who are looking to evaluate materials for alignment, and all of that's available on our website.
We also have links to those documents at the end of the PowerPoint, so when you receive the recording tomorrow, you'll be able to access those with just a quick link. Or check out the Twitter feed too. I think you might be able to get them there.
Great. All right, so we're going to take a look at some examples of each of the aspects of rigor in materials. So starting with this example, coming from 4th grade fractions, a big part of the work of 4th grade fractions is understanding equivalence. And so here is a conceptual understanding question that students need to really understand what it means to be equivalent. And then they get a constraint, so they have to work within that to think about generating equivalent fractions. Part B asks students to use a number line diagram, which is a big thing that we're looking for in materials that target conceptual understanding, the use of representation to help students deepen their understanding. The other thing I love about this question, which I think makes it worth sharing, is that we don't see Part C, which asks students to explain how they knew the fractions were equivalent. There's a writing piece, but it's very specific to the conceptual understanding that students need to demonstrate. And just kind of a plug here that not every question that gets the conceptual understanding needs to include a part where students are writing about their understanding. Really well-crafted questions can show us whether students have that understanding without having them write for each one. Another question in the same grade and the same domain, now we're thinking about fractions and decimals, is asking students to think about which number is larger, 1.7 or 17/12, and to explain without drawing a picture. So this is a great conceptual discussion question you would love to see as an opportunity for students to really talk through their ideas about math. Those of you who are really familiar with the 4th grade standards might be wondering about the use of 12. That's not within the range of what 4th graders need to be working with, but the way this question is constructed, they don't actually have to draw 12 to represent 12. They need to think about what they know about fractions, comparing tenths and twelfths, and thinking about decimals as well. So there's a lot built into this question that really pushes kids to think about the underlying ideas rather than just doing a procedure to compare two fractions. Thinking about procedural skill and fluency, we have a couple of different examples there to think about how kids are getting repeated practice and development throughout the year. So you can see an example of a book that has a warm-up that gives kids practice with multi-digit addition, kind of more of a fun game where kids are creating their own numbers and having an opportunity to add. And then the last piece, which is I think what people most traditionally think about with procedural skill and fluency, is we do want to see just kind of straight up computation problems so that kids are having different opportunities to practice, but also that teachers are able to leave the year knowing that kids have the procedural skill and fluency that they need to be successful in the next grade. And then our last example is around application. So this is a big non-example that we pulled out, but probably very familiar to a lot of the textbooks that we had growing up, and hopefully not too many of us are using with our students right now. This would be a lesson where kids are dividing multiples of hundreds by single-digit numbers. They got a whole page of practice problems, and then at the bottom they've got 2 word problems that just require them to do exactly what they've done for the last 17 problems. So there is no application of ideas here. There is no problem solving because students already know what they need to do, and they just have some words surrounding the numbers that they need to pull out and then divide. Similarly, sometimes we see application problems where the book says the first thing to do is to model a word problem step by step, and then to have students solve a very, very similar problem with different numbers using the same steps. Again, there's a way to take a word problem and make it so it's no longer an application problem if the work of figuring out the problem, the work of MP1 is done for students. So this is not what we want to see in aligned instructional materials. This example comes from 8th grade, and I'll give everyone just a minute to read through. So this is the kind of problem that we want to see in application. It's really asking students to make some assumptions to solve the problem. It's not just to choose an operation and do it or choose two operations. They need to apply what they know about fractions, about rates, to be able to solve the problem. So we are very curious to know what this makes you think about the materials that you are currently using. So we would like you to just take a minute and think about whatever materials you're currently using and how well you think they reflect the balance of rigor. And we're going to have a poll question coming to you. There we go.
And if you could just vote right on the poll, you can select the button. We will collect your responses.
All right, so let's take a look. So this is very interesting. It's heartening that a third of our participants feel like their materials balance it pretty well. We might later on ask people for suggestions in terms of what they're using that they think does it. But it is kind of an interesting holdover from, I think, old standards that materials that pay most attention to procedural skill and fluency are most prevalent. And I think that kind of reflects the shift in terms of how we used to teach math and now what we know students really need to be balanced in terms of and powerful mathematicians. Just one little plug, we know right now a lot of people are dealing with materials that are not fully aligned to Common Core, and we at SAP are about to embark on a project that is working with districts who are using Go Math and to think about alignment of those materials. So if that is something that you use and you're interested in hearing more, I'm going to ask people to email me. Joni's going to put up my email at the end, but we'd love to hear from you and talk more about the project with you. All right, so with that commercial being over, now we're interested in having you reflect a little bit about what do you do when things are not balanced. So we'd love for you in the question box to answer that question that's now on the screen about what do you do when your instructional materials don't reflect the balance of the three aspects of rigor. You can tell us a little bit about how you use time, how you use outside resources,
All right, so we're getting some good responses to this question, and Sandra is going to share some of those responses with the whole group.
Great. So we have use outside resources such as park sample items and district assessment databases. Use Google and search for it. How does one, oh, sorry, that was a different question. I use Achieve the Core, task focus for my planning. Write authentic word problems, just generally outside resources. Pull out the good stuff and trash the rest. I connect with other teachers online. We work on this together as a math PLC. Let's see. Search the internet to find what I need. The state of Illinois has lessons that I search. Refer to other teachers in the same grade to see how they taught the lesson. Go to ANET. I use my warm-ups as a way to fill in any gaps that my classwork materials may leave out. Lots of supplementals. Lots of supplements. Oh, someone said Google, reach out to colleagues, illustrative mathematics.
Yeah, illustrative mathematics is one I was going to name. I think especially for people who are dealing with materials that are more focused on procedural skill and fluency, you can really find good tasks that get to conceptual understanding and application.
I have to say, the engagement level of these participants tonight is outstanding. I can hardly keep up with it all.
I think the topic is really timely too for folks. I know that it can feel really frustrating to understand that our math instruction is supposed to have this balanced approach to really reflect that a student who is a proficient mathematician does understand concepts and can compute and fluently and can apply their mathematical knowledge. And it can be really frustrating when you understand that and yet don't have curricular resources to use that help support that level of instruction. So this is something that's difficult and challenging for teachers right now at this time in standards implementation.
All right, so we're going to move on to the last question. We've seen how Rigor is built into the standards. We've seen what to look for in instructional materials, and now is my favorite part, to think about the impact that it has on students and the possibility of what Balance of Rigor can do for our students and their mathematical thinking. Before we jump into that, I think it's worth talking about some myths of Rigor, and I think we've busted some of these myths already in our conversation. But one of the things that we see as teachers are trying to figure out how to best use time within their instruction, one of the things we see is that the idea that all three aspects have to happen every day and for equal amounts of time. So we've seen either programs that are set up to say you have an hour for instruction, 20 minutes is conceptual understanding, 20 minutes is application, 20 minutes is procedural skill and fluency. And although that might be true on some days, it doesn't make sense kind of as a blanket way of approaching it, because as we saw, if you're focusing on a specific standard, you want to make sure you're targeting the aspects of Rigor that are required by it and not just kind of using a blanket rule of how to use time. And that goes to the second myth of Rigor too that we talked about. Not every aspect needs to be addressed in every single standard. If we really listen, we'll see which aspect or aspects are there. The third one I think is a big one, to say kind of all three are important, but really this one is most important. And I think this one comes from partly why some of us went into math education, a lot of us did, because we really love for kids to be able to connect math to real life, and we might privilege application over all the rest of the aspects, or we really love that idea of having the aha moment when the mathematical idea makes sense to students and they really get the conceptual understanding. Or there might be some of us out there who just love doing fluency exercises when we were in school, and that's what gets us jazzed about teaching math. And I think, it's important for us to keep that passion and to also think about how the three are so interconnected that we need to make sure that we're focusing on all three. That last one is something that we heard about once, which was the way of addressing Common Core was to say we're doing application Fridays to make sure we get to it. And it's not the kind of best way to make sure that kids really have that balance. Again, as we saw, we're listening to the standards, we're making sure that sometimes we're doing them together, sometimes we're doing them apart. But so now that we've busted the myths, we're going to really think about what this looks like for kids in the classroom. So the task that you see is procedural skill work for first graders. They're working on adding within 20. And I want everyone to just take a minute and imagine what kind of response you would want to see from a student on these questions. So now that you have that in your head, think about what would a student who lacks conceptual understanding do to solve these problems, these procedural skill problems. So we actually have student work, so we can think about what that is. So we can see here the student went through each problem and they drew a circle to represent every number, and then you can actually see that they went back and they had to count all. You can see those little dots in the circles. So not a very efficient way to solve the problem. And they got the correct answer to all of them, but when we're thinking about first grade and we're thinking about what they know about addition and the properties of addition, we would want to see kids who were able to look at a problem like 21 and say, oh, I know 5 plus 5 is 10, and then I can just add on the 3 to get to 13, and I'm not going to need the one-to-one drawings to help me find the sum. We might even have kids who really understand addition well, who look at the relationship between number 5 and number 6 and to say, oh, I have 5 plus 5 in both of these. When I'm adding 4, when I'm adding 6, so the sum is going to be 2 more. So we can see in this problem that a student who had a good, solid conceptual understanding of addition is going to be even stronger in their procedural skill for solving addition problems. So moving on from our first grader to our fourth grade problem, we've got an application problem here from fourth grade. So go ahead and read the problem and then think about what you would want to see from a student in solving this problem. Now that you've got that ideal response in your head, think about what a student who is struggling with procedural skill, what they might do to solve this problem. So when we take a look at actual student work, we can see here we've got a student who read the problem, who is able to make sense of the problem and understand what it is that they need to do, that they need to figure out how many cups that they have, and then divide it by the number of tables. But when you look at the work, when they got to 27 times 12, they don't actually have a strategy that's going to give them the correct answer. And so when we think about students like this, we can be so excited about their ability to solve multi-step problems, but without having the procedural skill, they're not the powerful mathematicians that they need to be to really meet the expectations of the standard. So if we are only focusing on one area, then we end up with students who aren't reaching their potential in terms of the power of their math.
Well, and I appreciate these examples too, Arnie, because I know we talk all the time about students who struggle in math and how as teachers we can support them. And I think thinking about the balanced aspects of rigor, all three aspects of rigor, is another way to help us diagnose what students are having trouble with, which allows us to sort of focus on where they need help as well.
Right, and to diagnose their strengths, right? So this is a kid who didn't get the right answer, but we can be very excited with their ability to solve problems.
Absolutely.
All right, so thinking about this, we have one last reflection question for you. This work of creating a balance of rigor in instruction is really difficult. It's even more difficult when your materials aren't supporting you in doing that. It's difficult when there's something that you want to spend more time on in the class. We want everyone to think about right now if there is an aspect of rigor that's kind of out of balance in your classroom currently. And if that's the case, what could you do to ensure your instruction is more balanced?
We're going to give you a couple of minutes to type your responses into the question tab, and then we'll share some of the great learning that we hear going on from the group tonight. All right, Sandra, you want to share some of these good responses with us?
Yes, I hope I can read so fast. Let's see, I'm going to scroll up a little bit here to see. Actually, it is really kind of all over in what people are submitting. So it started off with a lot of conceptual understanding. Application is out of balance. We need to allow kids to problem solve more. I love that. I'm just constantly rewording problems, finding ways to redo the math, the way my students think about problems, researching application style problems. This would be a great discussion for PLCs. Let's see, synthesizing conceptual learning, having students see connections from one type of problem to a new one. Procedural skill and fluency among many of my 9th graders is lacking, so we spend a lot of time working on that, and then conceptual understanding. Conceptual understanding is the most difficult for my 4th graders. They know what to do, they know how to apply it, but asking them to explain it, we always end up with no participation. Let's see. I think most teachers are still too focused on procedural. My materials actually assume that students have a firm grasp on conceptual understanding and skill fluency when they don't. This makes application even more difficult. A lot who are kind of a lot of the comments seem to be struggling with really hard when they're coming to me without the conceptual understanding they need to do the rest of the work, and finding me to kind of fill in those gaps. And then some who are saying that they're lacking fluency, and most of the work that's being done is conceptual understanding. So all over.
All right, well, we're really excited about the things that you guys are engaged with, and we definitely see in the comments and questions that have come in tonight that this is a really challenging aspect of implementing the new math standards, and we'll all continue to work towards this and learn from one another. It would be awesome if you guys could share with us what you do as a result of having attended tonight's webinar, and we hope that we've pushed your thinking and that we've shared some resources that are going to help you as you work to attend to a balance of rigor in your classroom. We would really love to hear what that looks like. What will you do differently? Maybe you'll be thinking about how you use your class time a little bit differently as a result of having attended tonight. Or evaluate your assessment questions to be sure that they also reflect a balance in the 3 aspects of rigor. Maybe you'll use your textbook problem sets differently than you've used them in the past, or change up your classroom discussion questions so that you get that balance a little bit better, or even think about your homework assignments differently. So at the very end of the slide deck, again, when you get the recording, there's a link, and we would love for you to submit what you did and what impact it had on your students, on your classroom, and on their learning. We also would love for you to share some of your favorite sources of those supplemental resources. Where do you go to find good conceptual understanding problems if you have a textbook that's focused on procedural skill and fluency? How do you get those authentic application problems for your students to engage with? We would love for you to share that with us as well. So again, there's a link at the end of the PowerPoint that you can access once we send you the recording. You can also just tweet about it and hashtag Core Advocates. We'll see your suggestions. Would love to share those with us. And then, as Marnie mentioned earlier, the math team is kicking off a project using Go Math, and if you would like to learn more about that, you can email Marnie directly. Her email address is there on this slide as well. So we have some time now for any unanswered questions you might still have. Please just use that question box if there's anything you'd like to ask Marnie, specifically regarding any of the content from tonight.
So while people are doing that, I've flagged a couple of questions that were coming in that maybe we can kick off with. The first one, when we looked at some of those sample textbook pages, Marnie, the question that came in was that I think the drill and skill pages are still important for students to build fluency, so they need to know how to divide fluently before they can successfully solve any real world problem. So, how would you address that? Do we not ever want to see any of that, or where is the place for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that practice with the procedural skills is super important. We're not saying that. I think, you know, one of the challenges in the past has been that teachers have only given pages of practice without kind of thinking about how to help kids develop the fluency if they don't have it. So it's a way to practice, it's not a way to learn procedural skill and fluency, and that I think is just it's a little nuance there. In terms of the order, we get this question a lot in terms of which order should the aspects of rigor be taught in, and I would go back at risk of sounding like a broken record to say listen to the standards. So sometimes you'll see a progression where conceptual understanding is introduced earlier on, and then procedural skill and fluency, and then application. But a lot of times it shows up in the same grade where kids are being asked to make sense of the operations, do the operations, and apply them. And if that's the case, then I think it does make sense to kind of bounce back and forth. This might be an opportunity to focus individually on some aspects of rigor and then to tie them together so that kids are making the connection there.
Great. And so we had a question that actually so important it was repeated at least a couple of times, and I would just love, you know, to kind of hear your reaction to this. I think even maybe re-ask the question to the person who submitted it now that we've gone through this webinar today, which is, why didn't we just tag all the aspects of rigor in the standards so that there's less confusion among the teachers? Like, why didn't we just say to people, this is about procedure, this is about conceptual, this is about application?
Well, I wish this was a live PD, because then I would throw it back to the audience and ask someone to answer it. But I guess since we don't have an audience, I need to field it myself. I mean, I think that again, there's some nuance there. And I think that it is important to be able to parse that out as you're thinking about what the standards mean. So there isn't an answer key. We actually attempted once to create an answer key and realized that it didn't, not everything fits easily into a bucket. So that's part of the reason. Well, that would be my impression as not an author of the standards. But I think that I love the comment that this would be a great conversation for PLC, because I think, again, it's an opportunity to go deeper in talking about the standards, to learn something new from your colleagues, to argue about it, and to get smarter about what the expectations are for students.
Great. Let's see. I flagged one more question up here, which had to do with, you know, when you are teaching high school and students come to you with a lack of conceptual understanding, like time is an issue, like do you fill in the conceptual understanding piece from a previous grade? Do you just fill in like procedural skill from a previous grade? I think many teachers are kind of struggling with not only kind of content gaps, well, I guess that is a content gap, but some of this is more time intensive than others.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I was thinking about that even when I was giving the example about 6th grade. Like, the standards say that kids need to be dividing using the standard algorithm, but if there's missing pieces in place, then it is an opportunity for teachers to think about how to address those gaps while still moving towards the grade level material. And I would say that's the same thing for high school. I would give a plug now for our coherence map, which kind of helps identify where some of those gaps are. If you're a high school teacher, you can start kind of looking at 8th grade standards and what they map back to, and then thinking about how to fill in those gaps while still attending to grade level material. Joni, as a former high school teacher, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, no, I think the answer is the same regardless of the grade level that you're talking about. And I think it's easy as teachers to fall into the pattern of, I'm just going to teach a procedure as a way to get students to get an answer, because that ability to get an answer quickly by the end of the class period or by the end of the week is very satisfying to us and to students. And I think that again, it's listening to the standards and paying attention to the correct aspect of rigor. And again, the coherence map will help us determine if a student's difficulty lies with their lack of procedural knowledge or whether their difficulty lies with a lack of conceptual understanding. And I think really identifying what's at the heart of the student's issue and then addressing that issue, rather than trying to say, oh, well, the student is struggling, so I must need to focus on conceptual understanding, or I must need to focus on procedural skill. It isn't that simple. I think it depends on what the student is struggling with.
All right, we are at time, actually.
We are actually past a little bit.
Great engagement. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And just a little plug, we already have next month's webinar on the books at our usual time, the third Tuesday of the month at 7 o'clock Eastern time. So the registration link is here. We're going to be talking next month about how to prepare for high quality assessments, and we're talking not just about like state summative assessments, but also classroom assessments that you might give. So we look forward to seeing you next month, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight.